The Electric Drunk. I guess every town, no matter how small, has its man or woman of renown, that someone who seems to have stood out as unique, that person whose name is remembered and whose exploits are etched into local history. Well, such a man was Ed Maggard. Ed lived in Morehead, Kentucky around the turn of the century. He was an inventor and entrepreneur extraordinaire. Ed invented the first reliable portable motion picture projector, the Cosmograph, a vast improvement over Edison's original. With William Bradley, a financial backer, he founded the Cosmograph Company, and a factory began successfully producing the machines right here in Morehead. The company did just fine until the Tsar of Russia placed a very large order. The machines were built and shipped, but when the Tsar's agent was dispatched to deliver the money, he promptly absconded with the money to South America. Well, Ed also started the first movie theater in Morehead and was the designer, builder, and operator of the first electrical power plant in our small town. He was into a number of ventures, but perhaps most of all, he loved inventing and tinkering with electrical gadgets. Enter my father, who was a boy, also loved anything electrical and practically worshipped the ground that Ed walked on. He followed Ed around like a puppy, as Dad used to say, even wrangling a job in the Cosmograph factory for a short time and later in Ed's power plant. Ed took a liking to the young kid and would often invite Dad to visit his lab, which actually was his living quarters in an upstairs apartment. Dad said the place had gadgets and electrical devices scattered everywhere, and it seemed that with each visit Ed had a new and different project of some sort going. There was one problem with small-town life here in eastern Kentucky in the early 20th century, however: drunks. Many a knife and gunfight broke out as a result of imbibing a bit too heavily. So what else is new? One drunk in particular, however, while not violent, made a general nuisance of himself, not only to the town in general, but to Ed in particular. It seems that when he had had one too many, Roscoe would get awfully curious as to Ed's lab and what those fandangled contraptions were all about. He would stagger up the stairs to Ed's apartment and pound repeatedly on the door, sometimes in the middle of the night, insisting that Ed show him his latest invention. This had been going on for months, and Ed was tiring of this almost nightly routine. So one evening, while Dad was visiting, Roscoe stumbled up the staircase and began his usual bombardment of Ed's door, shouting his interest in seeing the inventor's latest project. Ed implored the drunk to leave, but that seemed to make him all the more persistent, and his incessant pounding became even louder. "Roscoe, give me a minute, and then you can come in," shouted Ed, thinking that he and Dad would slip out the window and down the fire escape and wait until Roscoe got tired and went home. Okay, Ed. Got to take a leak anyway," said the inebriate. Ed assumed that Roscoe would go downstairs and relieve himself against the side of the building, as any self-respecting drunk would do, but apparently Roscoe was soused completely out of his gourd that night, and instead simply relieved himself against the outside of Ed's door. Realizing what was happening, Ed was infuriated. He looked around and asked Dad to help him move to the door of the project he'd been demonstrating when Roscoe began his onslaught. Now, you may have heard of a Van de Graaff generator. You may have seen it demonstrated, even if you didn't know the name. It's a device for generating large static voltages and is often used in popular demonstrations to make your hair stand on end. Although the voltage is quite high, the current's low, and so there's no real danger. Other than a prickly sensation and your hair raising, you feel nothing when touching the discharge ball. But now a Tesla coil is something different. Here you're making miniature lightning bolts, and a good-sized coil can throw a discharge halfway across a room. The current can be high as well as the voltage, and so these are not toys. I think this is where I say, kids, do not try this at home. The Tesla coil Ed had built was fairly small, but still capable of throwing an arc about 6 or 8 inches. They moved it within inches of the metal doorknob. Roscoe had started banging on the door again, so it was with little trepidation that Ed shouted, "Well, come on in, Roscoe." At just the moment that the staggering sot took hold of the knob, Ed flipped the switch. Dad recounted the ear-popping crack as the miniaturized lightning bolt found and danced all over the handle of the door. He described the smell of ozone as being similar to that immediately after a lightning strike, pungent and strong. He also described the sounds coming from the other side of the door. None had realized at the time that by urinating and then standing in the puddle, Roscoe had created a perfect ground so that when he grabbed the knob, the shock was intensified that much more. Dad said there was thrashing, there was thumping, there was howling, and the puddle under the door grew even bigger. The current wasn't on more than a second or two, but for poor old Roscoe it must have seemed an eternity. Anyway, when they opened the door, there was Roscoe, his eyes wide, hair standing on end, mouth open and flapping, but no sound uttering forth. And without another word, he turned and walked down those stairs, the soberest man in Round County, and in need of a change of underwear. Roscoe may have continued to drink, but one thing was for sure. He never bothered Ed again. Despite the fact that Ed cleaned the hallway outside his room several times, Dad said the smell from Roscoe's encounter lingered for months afterward. I've often wondered if the Betty Ford Clinic might be interested in Tesla coils. Guess not. Too messy.